It was a rare, sunny morning in Flaxborough, the kind that made even the more stubborn chimneys appear cheerful. The residents, well trained in disappointment, received it warily, as if expecting the clouds to leap back at any moment. Nevertheless, the town looked unusually bright for a funeral. The late Mrs. Clementine Rooke had been a woman of subtle presence in life, and it seemed rather more noticeable in death. Her funeral drew a crowd larger than her friendship strictly warranted. But then, any event promising comparison guessing, and the gentle distress of others was well attended in Flaxborough. The mourners gathered at St. Elfrida's Church, a square, stubborn building whose stones looked as though they had been annoyed into place rather than laid. There were whispers even before the organ wheezed into life. "She was seen yesterday, you know," murmured Mrs. Prowse to her neighbour, pretending surprise at her own statement. "Yesterday?"
"Walking?" Her neighbour gasped, delighted. "Yes, just outside the post office."
"Pale, yes, but quite mobile." "Then what?" the neighbour asked in reverent dread. "Was in the coffin?" That, in fact, was becoming a question of general interest. The vicar, Reverend Snipe, was new to Flaxborough and not yet accustomed to the town's ability to turn solemnity into speculation with the efficiency of a municipal sewer system. His voice quavered as he read the customary assurances of eternal rest. He sensed, without daring to look up, the simmering expectation that the coffin might rattle or at least sigh for dramatic effect. Inspector Purbright was present, though not in any professional capacity. He sat in the rear pew, hands folded neatly, face mild. Some in attendance believed policemen must relish funerals. Purbright did not. They were, he felt, too public in their sadness and too private in their truths. He watched, he listened, but without intrusion. The pallbearers had just lifted the coffin when a hard, distinct knocking sounded through the church. It was not loud. It was not frantic. It was simply clear. A brief pattern of 3 taps, as if someone inside were politely requesting to be heard. The coffin tipped. Gasps rose like startled birds. One pallbearer let go entirely, provoking a wobble that nearly sent the box sliding. Reverend Snipe dropped his prayer book. Mrs. Prowse fainted, though in a graceful way that suggested long practice, and Purbright, without any change in expression, simply tilted his head. There was silence then, dense and expectant. Nothing followed. No further tapping. Only the faint, apologetic groaning of the organ bellows. The undertaker, Mr. Goff, cleared his throat. "Old wood? Gentleman, settling, perfectly ordinary. No one believed him, including Mr. Goff." The service proceeded with the artificial calm of a dinner party after someone has broken a family heirloom. After the interment, a subdued affair, no flowers thrown with enthusiasm. Purbright found himself approached by Miss Lydia Rooke, the deceased's niece and sole heir, a woman whose appearance tried for elegance but settled somewhere closer to careful thrift. "Inspector," she said, though he had not introduced himself. "I suppose you'll want to look into it?" Purbright regarded her pleasantly.
"Into what, Miss Rooke?"
She blinked. "Why, into that knocking, of course."
"People will talk."
"They always do."
"I should prefer matters to be
settled. One might argue," said Purbright gently, "that death is the most settled state available to us." Miss Rooke gave a tight smile that suggested humour was not something she reserved much storage space for. "Still," she said, "I should like the matter clarified. For my peace of mind." Purbright inclined his head. "Of course, peace of mind is terribly important in Flaxborough." She hurried away before he could determine whether she had taken that as reassurance or criticism. Later, near the churchyard wall, low, mossed, and vaguely resentful of being leaned on, Purbright listened to Constable Malley, who had witnessed something he was clearly eager to consider dramatic. "Begging your pardon?" "Sir, but Mrs. Prowse says she heard Mrs. Rooke last night as well." says she was knocking at her back gate at 11:30.
Called out her name even. And did Mrs. Prowse open the gate?
No, sir. She hid behind the pantry door.
Said she recognized the voice.
Said it was very persistent. Purbright nodded. Quite sensible of her. People who knock after 11:30 are rarely welcome. Mally looked relieved to have this philosophical support. But she's dead, sir. So we are told, Purbright replied. Yet, as you observe, the town remains unconvinced. He looked past the graves, orderly rows of stone avoiding each other's gaze. It was all quietly absurd, quietly unsettling, and entirely, unmistakably Flaxborough. Purbright smiled very slightly. Yes, Mally, he said. We shall make a few discreet inquiries. Flaxborough had many claimants to fame, though none had the good manners to be verified. One of the more robust traditions was the speed with which a piece of information, pure or adulterated, could travel from one end of the high street to the other. It was sometimes said that if the vicar sneezed in the vestry, the news would reach the hairdresser's before his handkerchief did. Thus, by late afternoon on the day of Mrs. Clementine Rook's funeral, 3 separate and confident versions of events had already settled into circulation. In the Green Lantern tea rooms, where lace curtains filtered light in a way that implied light needed moral correction, Mrs. Prowse held court from a wicker chair like a bishop in exile. Her audience consisted of 2 elderly ladies knitting grimly, a young mother whose infant slept in an expression of faint judgment, and Mrs. Clitheroe, who made a hobby of nodding importantly. I tell you, Mrs. Prowse said, touching her throat in a way that suggested she was reliving mortal peril. The voice was unmistakable. Clementine Rook herself, just outside my back gate, clear as bells. She said, "Let me in," and she knocked. 3 knocks. Just like today. Oh, it was her. Clementine had a way of knocking as though she disapproved of the door. Mrs. Clitheroe nodded, pained with understanding. "But did you open it?" "I did not. A woman alone must be prudent. Particularly with the dead," the 2 knitters murmured agreement, though their needles clicked disapprovingly at the notion that death might excuse impropriety. The young mother asked, in the tentative hope of normality, could it have been someone else imitating her voice? Mrs. Prowse's look suggested that this question fell below the acceptable standard of contribution. "My dear," she said, "people imitate fashion. They do not imitate Clementine Rook." Across town, at the Rotary luncheon, where casserole was consumed with moral seriousness, the story had taken on a sturdier, more practical tone. "A simple matter of trapped air in the coffin," declared Mr. Vole, who believed himself a science-minded man because he read labels on tonic water. Shift of temperature, expansion, perfectly natural.
Nothing supernatural at all. But Mrs. Prowse said, began Mr. Gell, a timid man accustomed to completing sentences only in the privacy of his own kitchen. Mr. Vole cut him off.
"Mrs. Prowse," he said, once reported seeing the ghost of her own cat, which was later found in her airing cupboard, perfectly alive and furious. "She is not a firm foundation on which to construct one's world view." This struck the table as sober analysis. Still, no one was entirely reassured. Meanwhile, Inspector Purbright took his afternoon walk along the high street, where shop windows displayed items of such modest ambition that one suspected they felt guilt over price tags. Purbright walked not so much to be seen as to be present, which in Flaxborough amounted to the same thing. He paused briefly outside Rook's Stationery and Gentleman's Sundries, the shop formerly belonging to the late Mrs. Rook. The windows were shuttered. A notice informed customers that the establishment was closed for respect, reorganization, and remaining matters of
estate. The order of significance was unclear. Purbright
noted the absence of dust on the shutter. Bolts. Someone had opened these recently. He did not linger, only tucked the observation gently where such things were kept in his mind, a place neither dismissive nor urgent. He next found his way to the Buick Arms, where opinion took the form of beer-scented certainty. "It weren't no knocking from inside," said Mr. Mudge, who considered himself a connoisseur of the paranormal since once encountering a fox in evening fog. "It were outside."
On the lid. Someone playing games. Then who? Asked the barman. Mr. Mudge leaned in, eyes narrowing with the relish of one about to release scandal. Her niece. That Lydia one.
"She's not right. Always looked like she were waiting for someone to admire her. And when no one did, well, I'll say no more." He then said considerably more, yet even here, where imagination was helped along by alcohol, the suspicion lacked conviction. Lydia Rook might be many things, but theatrical was not among them. At dusk the choir gathered at St. Elfrida's for their weekly attempt at harmony. The organist, Mr. Tolliver, felt it his duty to contribute his version of events in a thin, breathy voice that implied conspiracy. Clementine was no ordinary woman, he told the sopranos as they tuned. She had interests. When pressed, he explained that she once ordered a crate of foreign tea without consulting the grocer and had returned library books late on at least 3 occasions. This, in Tolliver's mind, formed a character of considerable mystery and possible moral unrest. The sopranos looked suitably alarmed. There is nothing so unsettling to respectable people as the suggestion of unexplained tea. By the time word reached the police station, the tale had condensed into a neat, marketable rumour. The dead woman is not dead. She is walking. She is knocking. She wants to come home. Constable Malley, who took a studious interest in the supernatural when it was phrased with enough authority, looked quite anxious. Purbright, meanwhile, organised his blotter tray. "Sir," Malley ventured, "there's talk that Mrs. Rook might have been, well, buried alive." Purbright made a soft, thoughtful sound. "If so, Malley, she has exhibited admirable restraint about the matter so far." Malley swallowed. "Should we exhume?" "Not yet. Exhumation is a grave step." He paused.
In every sense. Malley tried not to show admiration for the joke.
But failed. Purbright continued mildly. "We will begin instead by determining whether Mrs. Rook was, in fact, seen alive yesterday afternoon near the post office. If she was, we have an identity mistaken in death. If she was not, we have imagination mistaken in daylight. And if she was knocking last night?" Malley asked. Purbright looked at him kindly. "Then we have a great many questions, but we shall ask them one at a time, preferably of the living." Outside, the evening bells rang across Flaxborough, soft, measured, inevitable, like footsteps, or perhaps knocking. The following morning arrived in the ordinary way. A sensible grey light, a mild dampness in the air, and the sound of someone 2 streets away attempting to persuade a reluctant motor car that life was worth continuing. Flaxborough did not encourage spectacle. Even its ghosts, if they existed, were expected to keep within respectable boundaries. Inspector Purbright emerged from the police station with the unhurried air of someone who had already decided that the day would not be rushed. He carried no notebook, no briefcase, only his coat folded neatly over his arm. One learned in Flaxborough that real discoveries were made not in interrogation rooms but on pavements. He began, quite naturally, toward the post office, where Mrs. Rook had allegedly been seen the afternoon before her funeral. The building itself had the look of a mildly offended turtle, low and brickish, with a brass letter slot polished to the threshold of apology. Mrs. Bibby, the postmistress, presided behind the counter like a gentle but irrefutable customs officer of human behaviour. She had eyes that noticed everything and pretended to notice nothing, a talent Purbright valued greatly. "Good morning, Inspector," she said. "Stamp prices haven't gone up again, I promise." "Ah," Purbright replied. "Then perhaps today really will be a merciful one." She smiled at that, and something in her shoulders eased. Purbright could disperse tension the way some men disperse cigarette smoke, casually, without appearing to do anything. "I wondered," he began, "whether you or your clerks observed Mrs. Rook here, say yesterday afternoon?" Mrs. Bibby didn't stiffen. That would have acknowledged drama. Instead, she simply arranged her face into polite recollection. "People have said so," she replied. "But we have many ladies of her height and coat style, and most of them peer at envelopes suspiciously as though expecting treason inside." "Quite understandable," Purbright murmured. "Trust is a high-risk endeavour." Mrs. Bibby's smile flickered again. "The private kind one gives to a person who has said something true." "No," she said. "I didn't see her." "Neither did Mr. Flory. He keeps the afternoon shift, and he would remember." "He remembers faces like some men remember overdue debts." Purbright inclined his head. "Thank you." As he turned to leave, Mrs. Bibby added, in a tone that appeared off-hand but had been weighing itself for hours, "She was a punctual woman, Inspector, the sort who telephones to say she will be 3 minutes late. People like that do not simply fail to be seen." Purbright regarded her with quiet appreciation. "Yes," he said, "that is often the case." His next steps led toward Rook's stationery and gentleman's sundries. The shutters, once again, were firmly in place. The shop sign, black paint just beginning to flake, suggested a business that had not prospered, yet refused to give up the habit of existing across the street. Mr. Belwick, proprietor of a shoe repair and key-cutting establishment, was standing in his doorway. The position seemed less related to business strategy and more to a desire to observe anything of interest should it stroll by. "Sad business," Belwick said, without waiting to be asked. Purbright stopped. Belwick smiled as though acknowledging the start of a chess match. "You were acquainted with Mrs. Rook?" Purbright asked. "As one is acquainted with a postbox," Belwick replied, "seen oft and seldom addressed." "Would you say she had enemies?" Belwick's eyebrows rose slowly.
"Enemies? In Flaxborough?"
"Inspector, we have annoyances, resentments, and occasionally sharply worded notes pushed under doors."
"Enemies are very untidy." "Quite," Purbright said. Belwick leaned in, voice lowering, curiosity sharpening. "But it's strange, isn't it?
All this talk of her walking about. If a person wants to leave the world, the least one expects is consistency in the matter." Purbright smiled. "Indeed, the afterlife is generally considered a one-way arrangement." They exchanged a nod of an agreement that speculation should go no further while standing in public sunlight, and Purbright continued on. He walked next to the churchyard, where the grass had the resigned softness of ground accustomed to receiving people permanently. The headstones varied in confidence, some tall and assertive, some small and apologetic. There he found Reverend Snipe, hunched beside a rhododendron bush that had ambitions of becoming a wall. "Inspector," Snipe said, adjusting his glasses with a hand that trembled more from personality than age. "I hope you aren't here to ask whether I believe in ghosts." Purbright considered him gently. "Do you?" Snipe coloured. "I believe that the dead rest with God, and that the living have a remarkable talent for confusing themselves." Purbright nodded.
"A talent nearly unrivalled," the Reverend sighed. "I am afraid the funeral was—"
"Not what one hopes for a final farewell." The knocking, and then Mrs. Prouse collapsing like opera tragedy. "The congregation had only just begun taking me seriously, Inspector." "That will set me back weeks." Purbright glanced toward Mrs. Rook's fresh mound of earth, smoothed respectfully, but with a faint irregularity near the edging. He filed that away.
"Quietly, the church was not disturbed overnight?"
he asked. "Oh, no," Snipe said. Then added, tone darkening, "unless you count the vestry door being found unlatched this morning. But truly, everything of value is either hymnals or spiders." "Thieves would be disappointed." Purbright did not comment on the latch. There was no need. It would matter, or it would not, in time. On his way back toward Market Square, Purbright encountered Lydia Rook, dressed in a grey that aspired to elegance, but managed instead to look conscientious. She held a cluster of letters as though they were delicate and easily bruised. "Inspector," she began, with a faint breathiness suggesting she had rehearsed the moment. "I would like to stress that I have nothing to hide." "An admirable state," Purbright replied, though often difficult to maintain. Her mouth twitched in either irritation or relief. "It was hard to tell. I've been at the solicitor's," she said. "There are formalities."
"I intend to continue the shop, you know."
Aunt Clementine may not have had flair for business, but she believed in order.
"Order is something we've lost lately, Inspector."
"Don't you agree?" Purbright studied her just long enough to encourage honesty. "I believe," he said, "that order is most valued by those who fear its collapse." She looked at him, fully, sharply. For the first time, there was something wounded there, or perhaps something defended. "I should go," she said suddenly.
"People stare."
"I dislike being stared at." She left at a brisk pace. Her letters clutched like evidence. Purbright watched her go, not suspiciously, merely attentively. He returned to the police station with neither urgency nor disappointment. He had learned what he intended to learn. No one had seen Mrs. Rook at the post office, and yet someone believed they had. The shutters at her shop had been opened, then closed again, by someone who did not wish to be observed, and the vestry door had stood unlatched overnight, quietly, without announcement. All small things, all patient, all waiting. Purbright sat down, opened his blotter, and wrote nothing. Thinking, for him, was best done in the margins. The offices of Bletchem & Co. Solicitors occupied the second floor above a shop that sold ornamental cushions embroidered with the names of towns no one admitted visiting. The staircase smelled faintly
of dust and lavender polish, a scent that suggested.
The building had once been grand and now remembered it only in occasional sighs. Inspector Purbright climbed the steps without hurry and was shown into a room where Mr. Lionel Bletchem presided at a desk of such dark wood and such solemn presence that one felt it should have been. Addressed as Sir Bletchem, was a man of soft voice and precise grooming, whose hair parted with architectural confidence and whose spectacles balanced on his nose as though reluctant to get involved in anything messy. "Inspector," he said, rising half an inch in acknowledgement. "What a pleasure under unfortunate circumstances." Purbright offered a courteous nod. "I understand you acted for the late Mrs. Clementine Rook." "Yes." Bletchem folded his hands with the reverent air of someone discussing a civic monument. "Miss Rook is attending to certain matters of estate as we speak, though I imagine," he added, adjusting his glasses, "you are here regarding the recent disturbances." The word hovered, politely horrified. "Only to understand her affairs," Purbright said. "People do not behave in extraordinary ways unless something in their ordinary life encourages them to." Bletchem considered this, and finding no fault, opened a drawer. He produced a slim folder, the sort used to contain secrets that were not quite dramatic enough for envelopes with red seals. "Mrs. Rook was frugal," he said.
"Conscientious."
"She paid bills early, kept receipts, and maintained her accounts with the regularity of someone who mistrusted both banks and the afterlife." "No debts?" Purbright asked. "None of note?" The solicitor's eyes twinkled faintly. "Unless you count overdue subscriptions to the Ladies' Amateur Ornithology Circle. A matter of 1 shilling and 6pence, I believe." Purbright smiled politely.
"And her heir?"
"Miss Lydia Rook," Bletchem said. "Only living relative."
"Lives modestly."
"No luxuries, no vices, unless one considers orderliness a vice." Purbright allowed that some did. "There is the shop, of course," Bletchem continued, "and a modest insurance policy."
"Very modest," he leaned back.
"Not the sort of sum one fakes death for, if I may be plain." Purbright gave a small nod. "Please be as plain as you like. Plainness saves time." Bletchem hesitated, just long enough to make the moment noticeable. "There was," he said, "a curious matter. Mrs. Rook had withdrawn a small sum in cash the day before her death." "Out of character?" She had not made a cash withdrawal larger than £2 in months.
This was 15. For what purpose?
That, Bletcham said, remains unclear. He closed the folder gently, not to conceal anything, but because everything in this office was done gently. Miss Rook doesn't know.
Purbright asked. She claims not, Bletcham replied. And I see no reason to doubt her. A pause, thin but noticeable.
Yet I cannot quite bring myself to believe her.
Either. Purbright thanked the solicitor and took his leave. No dramatic exits.
Just the quiet closing of a door that had many such closings before it. Outside, the street hummed in its unobtrusive Flaxborough way. Slow bicycles, distant kettle whistle, the sort of murmured conversation that concealed more than it revealed. Purbright walked toward Rook's stationery and gentleman's sundries, feeling no urgency and no expectation. He merely observed. The shop door was open. This was new. Inside, Lydia Rook stood behind the counter, sorting ledgers with the rigid movements of someone intent on being seen as occupied. The bell above the door chimed a small, apologetic note. She looked up. Slight startle, slight relief, both hidden quickly. Inspector.
I didn't expect you today. Nor did I, Miss Rook, Purbright said pleasantly.
I find most days arrive without consultation. She gave a faint exhale that might have been a laugh if it had felt safer to be one. The shop was tidy, aggressively so. Shelves aligned like soldiers, pens grouped in rows as though awaiting inspection. The kind of order that suggested not calm, but containment. Purbright let his gaze drift without making a show of it. You are reopening quickly, he remarked. Lydia straightened. Business must continue. People talk if shutters stay closed. They talk if they open too soon. One must choose which talk to endure. True, Purbright said. Of the two, the conversation about premature activity is usually shorter. She seemed unsure whether that was humour or comment. She chose not to decide. There have been suggestions, Purbright said lightly, that your aunt was seen alive after her death. Lydia closed her ledger very gently.
Not startled, but controlled. That is foolishness, she said evenly.
People see what they wish when loneliness encourages it. A tidy observation, Purbright said.
I may borrow it. Her eyes flicked, brief, sharp, as though startled by approval. And the knocking.
He added, mild as milk. Her hands tightened, but her tone did not. Settling wood. Box joints. It happens in heat changes, Purbright nodded. Yes. Undertaker Goff explained something similar. This time she did not hide the flicker of dislike. Mr. Goff, she said, never liked my aunt. He once told her she made funerals difficult. That seems a rather personal remark for an undertaker. She insisted on choosing her own coffin.
Every detail.
Engraving, lining, varnish tone. She said it was foolish to leave these judgments to others. Mr. Goff believed it interfered with the dignity of the trade. Purbright absorbed this.
And filed it gently. Your aunt was a woman of preparation, he said. Lydia looked at him. Weary,
brittle, honest. My aunt was afraid of being forgotten. She prepared so she would take up space even when gone. Purbright watched her for a moment, her posture defending not grief, but identity. He said only, "That is very human." She blinked, once, as if something had loosened behind her ribs. He did not push further. He thanked her. He left. The undertaker, Mr. Goff, was polishing a hearse when Purbright arrived. He did so with reverence, with the way one polishes something that does not forgive fingerprints. "Inspector," Goff said, in a tone that implied he had anticipated this visit and resented having been correct.
I assume this is about the unfortunate incident, Purbright nodded.
The coffin.
And Mrs. Rook. Goff wiped the cloth across the fender. in slow, stern circles. Mrs. Rook was peculiar. Not unpleasant, you understand.
Simply involved. She liked to supervise. Some believe death frees one from such habits. He sniffed. It does not. Purbright waited. She came to me 3 months ago, Goff continued. Said she wished to prearrange her burial.
Every detail.
Down to a miniature silver charm sewn into the pillow lining. What sort of charm? Purbright asked. Goff hesitated, not theatrically, but with discomfort. A bell. Purbright did not blink. A bell, he repeated. Yes, Goff said. Defensive now.
A decorative one, symbolic. Something to do with reassurance, she said.
People comfort themselves in strange ways.
I am merely a tradesman, Inspector. I do not interpret Purbright.
Thanked him. He walked away slowly, not alarmed, not satisfied. Simply thinking. The vestry of St. Elfrida's had the air of a room that
had never quite recovered from being useful.
It contained, in roughly equal measure, hymnals in varying conditions of despair, cassocks that smelled faintly of damp reverence, and a number of folding chairs that appeared to have surrendered long ago to whatever fate awaited them. Reverend Snipe had summoned Inspector Purbright with the apology of a man who suspected he might be wasting everyone's time, but could no longer bear the responsibility of silence. It's just there, Snipe said, as though pointing out something indecent. On the chair. Purbright entered the vestry with the same slow care one applies when approaching a sleeping cat that may not, in fact, be asleep. His gaze rested on the object in question. A handbag, ordinary in shape, modest in colour. A soft brown leather with careful stitching. There was nothing remarkable about it, and yet its presence was entirely incorrect. Purbright said nothing at first. The Reverend fidgeted. It wasn't here yesterday, Snipe added, or the day before. I tidied the room myself before the funeral service. Tidied, he repeated, in a way that suggested tidying had taken on moral significance during his tenure. Purbright stepped closer. He did not touch the handbag, not yet. Whose is it? He asked. Reverend Snipe swallowed. Mrs. Clementine Rook's. Purbright nodded once, not as confirmation, but as acknowledgement of weight landing. She carried it everywhere, Snipe murmured. Even to choir practice.
And the market, and the library.
She said a lady should always be prepared to receive news, good or bad. She liked pockets, you see, but never trusted them. Purbright bent slightly, examining but not disturbing. There was a faint crease across the strap, recently made, the sort caused by being slung over a shoulder. This was found...
Open? Purbright asked. No, closed, Snipe replied.
Neatly, as though placed, not dropped. Purbright nodded again. He lifted the bag gently, carefully, as though removing an object from its memory rather than its location. Inside he found a neatly folded handkerchief, embroidered CR in small, precise stitches, a compact mirror, the glass uncracked, a small tin of peppermints, a coin purse containing 11 shillings and a 3-penny bit, and, tucked in one interior pocket, a folded scrap of paper. Purbright withdrew the paper and unfolded it slowly. It contained a single line, written in a handwriting that was deliberate and elegant. Do not be alarmed.
I simply require a little more time. The words lay flat and undramatic, as though utterly sure of themselves. Reverend Snipe's breath made a small, terrified squeak. Purbright's expression did not change.
He simply refolded the note and placed it back inside the bag. One should not jump to conclusions, he said softly. No, of course not, Snipe gasped, eager to be reassured. Only, well, if she wrote that after her death, Purbright interrupted kindly. Let us consider less complicated possibilities first. Notes can be misplaced or rediscovered long after their writing. Yes, Snipe said, relieved. Yes, of course. People forget things. Then after a moment, but Inspector, she never forgot anything. Purbright did not answer. He carried the handbag with him back through the church, down the stone steps, and into the mild daylight. The town square was quiet, yet not empty. People walked with the subdued haste of those who do not wish to be observed, but hope very much to see something themselves. Constable Malley was stationed near the police entrance, polishing a bicycle with the intensity of a man attempting to impress destiny. "Sir," he said, seeing the handbag. "Fetch Mrs. Lydia Rook," Purbright replied calmly. "Ask her to come here when convenient. Do not mention the purpose."
"And do not mention where it was found." Malley nodded, then realized he was expected to execute discretion.
His face adopted the careful blankness of someone trying very hard not to think in public. Lydia arrived 27 minutes later, looking composed in that careful way a person looks when composure is all they have left. "Inspector," she said. "I was told it was important." Purbright placed the handbag on the desk very gently. Lydia stared at it. Her breath did not catch. Her hand did not shake. She simply stared. "That was my aunt's," she said quietly. "Yes," Purbright replied. "It was buried with her." "No," Purbright said. "It was found in the vestry this morning." The silence that followed was not shock. It was calculation. Lydia closed her eyes briefly, as though revisiting a thought she had hoped would remain unfinished. "I see," she said. "No fear."
No denial, just "I see." Purbright waited.
He was patient. He was always patient. Finally, Lydia spoke. "My aunt did not trust the idea of death." Purbright nodded slightly. "I have come to understand that." "She believed," Lydia continued, choosing each word carefully, "that one should prepare the terms of one's departure. She said the grave should never be a place one must hurry into."
She believed in exits.
Graceful exits. Purbright allowed silence to welcome more. "She was not afraid of dying," Lydia said. "She was afraid of doing it wrong." Purbright's voice remained very gentle. "Was she afraid of being buried alive?" Lydia's eyes flicked a small, sharp movement. "She read accounts," she said. "Medical errors, early burials." She once said, "I don't want to leave unannounced." Purbright studied her carefully. Not her words, but her breathing. "And did she ever mention?" he asked. Requiring more time, Lydia's face closed, not in denial, but in recognition. "I don't know what you want me to say, Inspector." "I want only what is true," Purbright said. "And there is no need to rush the truth." Lydia seemed to deflate, not defeated, simply tired. She didn't want to die, she whispered. She simply wanted to choose when. Purbright nodded. He did not comfort her. He did not accuse her. He simply said, "Someone opened the vestry door last night. Someone who knew where this handbag belonged. Someone who wished it to be found." Lydia did not answer, but her silence spoke very clearly. The undertaker's premises, Goff & Sons, Itia, 1894, occupied a brick building that looked permanently overcast even on bright days. The curtains in the display windows were always drawn halfway, as though the business were in a state of perpetual discretion. Inspector Purbright arrived just as Mr. Goff was arranging sprays of white lilies in the front corridor, in the manner of someone performing a duty he had not chosen, but had long since stopped resisting. "Inspector," Goff greeted, without warmth or hostility, merely habit. "If you've come for reassurance, I regret to say we've run out." Purbright smiled mildly. "I rarely seek reassurance."
"It is neither accurate nor durable." Goff considered this and gave a small grunt that might have been approval. They walked toward the preparation room, though Goff stopped short of opening its door, as if some things were better left implied. "I understand," Purbright began.
"That Mrs. Rook's coffin was prepared under her own instructions." Yes, Goff replied. She left nothing to chance. Paint finish, hinge type, interior fabric, inscription. She even selected the exact firmness of the headrest pad. One must be comfortable, she said. I recall thinking the sentiment lacked foresight. Purbright nodded.
And the bell sewn into the lining. Goff stiffened. Not dramatically, more like a man bracing himself against a draft. Yes, he said, heavy with resignation.
A small charm bell, silver, about the size of a thimble. She insisted it was sentimental. I did not ask further. A funeral director must be cautious about inviting explanation. Purbright's tone remained conversational. And did she ask for anything else unusual? Goff hesitated, truly hesitated, for the first time. She requested, he said, choosing words as though handling fragile glass, that the coffin not be sealed until the morning of the service. She cited religious reasons.
None that I had ever heard of, mind you.
But she paid in advance, and such requests are not without precedent. Purbright absorbed that quietly. And was the coffin unsealed until that time? He asked. Yes, Goff said. I personally checked it.
I placed the final screws myself.
There was no possibility of... He trailed off, unwilling to finish the sentence. Purbright did not require him to. Instead, he asked, What time did you seal it? Goff blinked.
8:30.
The morning of the funeral, Purbright's voice remained very gentle. And who attended afterward? Goff exhaled slowly. The church caretaker.
Reverend Snipe, and his face tightened as though regretting the need to say it.
Miss Lydia Rook, Purbright nodded once. Was the vestry door unlatched that morning when you arrived? He asked. No, Goff said. I am certain. I check every door and latch as a matter of procedure. Then it was opened later, Purbright murmured. Goff rubbed his forehead, weary. Inspector, I have buried over 400 residents of this town.
I have never had one of them come back to haunt me. I do not intend to begin now, Purbright smiled very slightly. Nor do I, he said.
Yet here we are. From Goff and Sons, Purbright walked to the Half Moon, a pub that believed itself more refined than it was and compensated by dimming the lighting to levels that required apologies from furniture. Inside, Mr. Tolliver, the organist, was already at a corner table, nursing a sherry with the seriousness of a surgeon preparing for delicate work. He brightened when Purbright approached, sort of brightening. That suggested he had been waiting for precisely this.
Moment, Inspector. Sit, drink, interpret.
Death with me. Purbright declined the drink, but accepted the seat. You attended the funeral, he began. Of course, Tolliver said. One does not miss such a display. The knocking, beautifully timed, disturbing in the true aesthetic sense.
I confess I was moved. Moved to what? Purbright asked. To consider Clementine's character, Tolliver said.
She had always carried a sense of unfinished business, like someone who keeps a suitcase packed but never departs. A poetic image, Purbright said. Yet I prefer the precise to the poetic. Tolliver leaned in. She was preparing for something, he whispered. She told me once, while adjusting her hymn book, that she disliked transitions. Life leaves things untidy, she said.
I will not. Purbright gave a soft, thoughtful sound. Did she fear death?
No, Tolliver said. She feared obscurity. Purbright left the Half Moon and walked the long way back to the station, through the marketplace, past the tailors that had never once completed trousers on time, past the chemists that stocked 3 brands of cough mixture but none that worked, past the bus stop where 2 young boys were arguing about which saints were the most useful. Flaxborough was very much alive, which made its ghosts all the more inconvenient. Constable Malley looked up as Purbright entered the station. Sir, he said, trying to look composed, we've received a report. Purbright removed his coat and waited. Malley swallowed. Mrs. Prowse claims she saw the deceased again.
At twilight.
Standing at her garden gate, wearing her usual coat.
Holding a handbag, Purbright did not react. And did she speak?
Yes, sir. Mrs. Prowse says she said, quote, Tell Lydia not to hurry me. Purbright closed his eyes very briefly, not in disbelief, but in thought. "And yet," he said softly, "we have her handbag here." "Yes." "Sir," Mally said. Purbright's eyes opened. "Then we must consider one of two possibilities, Mally." "Yes, sir."
Either Mrs. Prouse is mistaken, or...
Mally asked, bracing. "Or someone very much alive," Purbright said, "is walking this town wearing the face and habits of Clementine Rook." Mally stared. Purbright simply sat, not satisfied,
not alarmed.
Only patient. The living, he knew, were far more troubling than the dead. Night in Flaxborough did not arrive dramatically. It settled, like a shawl placed gently over the shoulders of a reluctant aunt. Street lamps glowed with the modest conviction of things that had been lit for decades and intended to continue, regardless of appreciation or effect. Windows dimmed one by one, some drawn carefully, some in sudden darkness as though the homeowner had simply remembered sleep all at once. It was on such a night, uneventful except for its possibilities, that Mrs. Cribben, who lived facing the churchyard, found herself awake. She claimed later it was indigestion. Her husband insisted it was conscience. The doctor suggested the two were often indistinguishable, whatever the cause. Mrs. Cribben entered her front sitting room sometime after 11, lit only by the uncertain light of the street lamp filtering through lace. She stood there, wrapped in a shawl of sturdy wool, thinking of nothing in particular, or, as she later described it, thinking about everything at once, and she saw movement out among the gravestones, in the soft blue-grey light, a figure, tallish, wrapped in a dark coat, head covered in a scarf, knotted under the chin in the old-fashioned widow's way, moving slowly, deliberately, not wandering, walking to something. Mrs. Cribben held her breath. The figure did not flicker or fade like imagination. It was solid. It stopped at Mrs. Clementine Rook's grave. Then, and here Mrs. Cribben's voice always dropped, it knelt. Not mournfully, not dramatically, but with familiarity, as though it were tucking something in. The next morning, Constable Mally arrived pale, earnest, and slightly damp, as though the night's report had rinsed something out of him. "Sir," he said to Inspector Purbright, who was engaged in the quiet art of buttering toast, "there's been—"
"An occurrence." Purbright looked up mildly. "At the churchyard?"
Mally blinked. "Yes, sir."
"How did—" But Purbright applied the second layer of toast.
"People do not walk cemeteries at night without wishing to be noticed."
"Even if the notion is to go unnoticed."
"Which rather defeats both intentions," Mally, accustomed by now to not fully understanding his superior, simply nodded. "Mrs. Cribben says it was Mrs. Rook herself," he added, in a tone that attempted neutrality but fell closer to apprehension. Purbright folded his napkin. "As do others," he said. "But clarity rarely comes from the first story told, nor the second." Flaxborough's churchyard was damp with early mist, the grass dewy and submissive underfoot. Purbright approached the grave of Clementine Rook with the same respect he would afford a conversation that was not yet ready to be spoken aloud. There were footprints, clear ones, not the deep, careless prints of a wandering night walker, but precise, placed carefully. They circled the grave once, and only once, before stopping at its head. Purbright crouched, not touching the prints, simply observing their language. They were small, a woman's shoes, and recent enough that the outline had not blurred. Reverend Snipe appeared from the vestry door, clutching a warm mug of something that seemed medicinal in both smell and temperature. "I didn't see anyone," he said immediately, defensively. "The latch was secured last night."
"I checked it twice."
"I always check twice," Purbright nodded. "The figure was seen outside the church, not inside." "Yes, but people don't walk in cemeteries at night, Inspector."
"Not decent people, anyway."
"It's impolite to the residents." Purbright allowed the remark the appropriate weight. "And no one has disturbed the grave?"
No, Snipe said quickly.
Heavens, no. Then in a smaller voice, though the soil looked
Brushed. Purbright looked again. He saw it too. Not dug, not tampered.
but smoothed, as though someone had placed a hand upon it, or simply wanted it to look undisturbed. Word spread.
As it always did, by mid-afternoon at the hairdresser's.
Mrs. Cribben was being praised for bravery at the butcher's. Mr. Mudge insisted it had been a tax collector in disguise at the library. Miss Pell opined that resurrections were largely metaphorical unless one introduced sarcasm, and at the Green Lantern tea-rooms, Mrs. Prowse said nothing, which was, of course, interpreted by all as confirmation. Lydia Rook did not appear in public that day. The absence did more than presence ever could have. Purbright visited her that evening. The bell above the shop door chimed, and Lydia emerged from the back room, sleeves rolled, hair slightly undone, the look of someone working beyond the point of usefulness. She did not ask why he had come. "You've heard," she said simply. Purbright nodded. "Someone visited your aunt's grave last night." Lydia looked at him.
Not startled, but expectant. "And you want to know," she said softly.
"Whether it was me." Purbright waited. Lydia spoke in a voice that had stopped fighting the tremor beneath it. "I went to the cemetery yesterday afternoon. To tidy the flowers. That is all. I did not go at night." Purbright said nothing. He watched how she breathed, not what she said. "My aunt," Lydia continued, "liked to be remembered. Every year on her birthday, she would put flowers on her own mother's grave, not for grief, but for presentation. She said most mourning is for the living." Purbright gave a single, slow nod. "It often is." Lydia's eyes glimmered just slightly, not with tears, but pressure. "I know what they say," she whispered, "but the dead do not walk."
"Inspector?" Purbright responded gently. "No, but the living may walk in their place." A silence opened, delicate and brittle. Lydia did not break it as Purbright left the shop.
Dusk sank again into Flaxborough. A distant dog barked. A bicycle bell chimed. Life continued, untroubled by those without breath, but the churchyard remained very quiet, as though waiting for someone to return once more. The following morning, Inspector Purbright sat at his desk with the air of a man who was not waiting for answers, but rather allowing them to settle into place like dust in an undisturbed room. He did not pace, nor mutter, nor ruminate aloud. He simply thought, which in Purbright's case meant observing the movements of the world until they assembled a pattern. Constable Malley entered cautiously, as though Purbright's thoughts might be startled by abrupt motion. "Morning, sir?" "Good morning, Malley." Malley stood in awkward readiness. "No new sightings of the deceased," he reported. "Yet." "Reassuring," Purbright said, without suggesting that he believed it. Malley hesitated. "So do you think she
"Is dead?" Purbright's face remained calm, almost kindly. "Malley," he said, "in Flaxborough, death is rarely the end of a story."
"It is often merely a change in audience," Malley frowned. His brow always furrowed when philosophy appeared unexpectedly.
"Meaning?"
Purbright folded his hands lightly. "Meaning we should look, not for ghosts, but for needs. People do not create mysteries unless they require something from them." Malley nodded slowly, though the idea had not reached comfortable residence in his mind. "Yes, sir?" He left. Purbright resumed stillness. Outside, the town was adjusting to the new tension the way Flaxborough always adjusted, by talking diligently about everything except the thing itself. A notice at the post office announced a sale on envelopes, as though correspondence might soothe collective
nerves. The Green Lantern. Tea rooms had doubled.
Their sugar supplies, emotional strain being sweetened. Customarily, the church choir had decided to rehearse a hymn about steadfastness, but sang it rather anxiously. Even the pigeons seemed to walk a little more purposefully in the square. Purbright walked among all this with gentle interest, absorbing not what was said, but what was not said. People kept glancing toward the churchyard, then looking away, quickly, not fear, not superstition. Something closer to unease at something nearly familiar, as though the town had encountered itself in the dark and had not liked the resemblance. Purbright paused at the low stone wall of St. Elfrida's, where frost had settled into the stone like old stories etched in cold. He stood, not facing the graves, but facing the street. Behind him, death. Before him, life. Between them, only a short walkway, a very narrow distance, Purbright reflected, for the living to cross when they wished to carry something from one side to the other. He let the thought rest. Around mid-morning, he walked to the library where Miss Pell, the librarian, organized knowledge with the devotion of a monk copying sacred texts. She regarded him with the weary affection of someone who had spent 30 years waiting for the town to become more
literary. Inspector, she said.
You are here for information or for silence? Whichever you are willing to spare, Purbright replied. Miss Pell considered him, then closed her ledger with the grace of someone closing a prayer book. Mrs. Rook used to sit by the window in the afternoons, she said. Always the same table, always with an old copy of the Country Almanac, which was not, I believe, read so much as consulted. She planned? Purbright asked. She anticipated, Miss Pell corrected. She liked schedules, timetables, natural cycles, the expectation of things. She feared interruptions. Purbright absorbed this with interest. And Miss Lydia? He asked. Miss Pell's mouth twitched. She reads only reference books.
Books that explain. I have never seen her read a novel. That suggests something, Purbright murmured. Yes, Miss Pell said.
That she does not care to meet unfamiliar feelings unless she can first label them. Leaving the library, Purbright crossed the square to the bus stop bench, where two elderly men were engaged in the respectable tradition of discussing municipal failings. One of them, Mr. Spraggs, nodded at Purbright with the solemnity of greeting a figure both useful and mildly disappointing. Morning, Inspector? Cemetery's been busy, Purbright waited. Mr. Spraggs sniffed. Not with mourners, with watchers, people waiting for a performance. Like the theatre, only cheaper. His companion, Mr. Quine, added, They're hoping for something to explain their own lives, if you ask me. The dead walking is tidy compared to the living making a muddle of things, Purbright smiled. A concise sociological analysis, Mr. Quine. The old man shrugged. We've nothing else to do but observe, Inspector. Yes, Purbright said softly, and yet most of us spend our lives avoiding the things we notice. The men fell silent, not offended, but thinking. Purbright continued his walk. He found himself eventually by the river, where the water moved slow as conversation on a dull afternoon. Ducks drifted with a kind of practical uncertainty, as if they had come to accept that purpose was largely something other people expected of them. Purbright sat on a bench and let the quiet unfold. He thought of Mrs. Clementine Rook, a woman who planned her
funeral, who chose her coffin, who insisted on a bell, who
feared being forgotten more than being gone. He thought of Lydia Rook, controlled, contained, afraid of being seen incorrectly. A person who lived in reference books to avoid emotional ground. He thought of the grave. Smoothed, not disturbed, visited, not vandalized. He thought of the handbag, not stolen, not hidden, placed. Everything pointed not to panic.
Nor guilt, nor haunting, but
intention. Someone was curating the appearance
of a return, but not revealing the
purpose. Not yet. Purbright folded his hands. Human beings did not fear death half as much as they feared being misremembered. Some people, he reflected, attempt a resurrection not of the body but of the self. to be seen one last time, correctly, or at least convincingly. He thought of the note, "Do not be alarmed."
I simply require a little more time. Time for what? For farewell? For confession?
For revenge? For dignity? The dead do not ask for time, but the living do. Purbright stood. The river glided on, untroubled. He did not hurry. He knew now someone had not finished their departure, and someone else perhaps could not allow them to. The idea of a tea gathering, particularly one hosted by Inspector Purbright, was sufficiently unusual to provoke interest and attendance. Flaxborough's inhabitants were not immune to curiosity, and curiosity in Flaxborough travelled more swiftly than ambulances. Purbright sent invitations personally, each handwritten with the neat, careful strokes of someone accustomed to leaving nothing undefined. Lydia Rook, Mrs. Prowse Reverend Snipe, Mr. Goff, Miss Pelland. For texture rather than contribution, Mr. Tolliver, who never failed to produce observations nobody wanted, but everyone listened to. He chose the Green Lantern tea rooms, not for their comfort, which was debatable, nor their cake, which was doctrinally dry, but because the tables were small and the sound carried well. People seated there could hear nothing they wished to, and everything they didn't. Purbright arrived early. He selected a table in the corner where he could see all the others without appearing to watch them. He ordered tea, buttered scones, and a modest cake that resembled a moral lesson disguised as dessert. He waited. They arrived in the order one might expect. Mrs. Prowse first, eager, breathless, her shawl arranged to suggest frailty, but her eyes alert as a terrier in a butcher shop. Reverend Snipe next, anxious, bending slightly as though already apologizing for the conversation. Mr. Goff followed, solemn as ever, his presence like a church bell at half muffle. Miss Pell came in briskly, as though she had not decided to attend until halfway through the door. Tolliver drifted, vapour-like. And finally, Lydia Rook, composed, almost calm, but in that precise way that indicated her hands had been clenched before arrival. Purbright stood, greeted each warmly and gestured to the table. "Thank you all for coming."
This is not an official matter. Only conversation. This was both true and untrue, and everyone there understood the distinction. Tea arrived.
Cups clinked. Spoons stirred. People arranged their expressions. Purbright allowed silence to fill the table like a faint mist before he spoke. "There has been talk," he said pleasantly, "of late visits to the churchyard." Mrs. Prowse shivered theatrically. "Delighted." Reverend Snipe pursed his lips. Tolliver sighed, as though contemplating a tragedy in 5 acts. Lydia lifted her cup, steady, perfectly steady. "And," Purbright continued, "talk of Mrs. Rook being seen."
It is a remarkable thing how we see what we miss. His voice was gentle, almost warm. People do not fear ghosts.
"They fear the unfinished." Miss Pell nodded. Mrs. Prowse dabbed her eyes in anticipation of sentiment. Lydia did not move. Purbright set his teacup down. "I have been wondering," he said softly, "who Mrs. Rook believed would understand her, who she thought might help her." "Complete something," Mr. Goff exhaled through his nose. "The dead require less from the living than you imply, Inspector." Purbright smiled slightly. "Not always." Silence again, but a different kind now. Denser. Listening. He turned to Lydia last, not dramatically, not accusingly, simply naturally. "Miss Rook," he said, "you knew your aunt better than anyone. What do you believe she wanted in her final days?" Lydia's hand tightened slightly around her cup, the first visible breach in her otherwise impeccable.
"Poise. She wanted to be remembered," she said. Her voice was soft, honest, too honest. She wanted to be seen.
Lydia added. There it was. The first small crack, Mrs. Prouse leaned in, delighted by unfolding sorrow. Miss Pell watched with the stillness of a hawk. Reverend Snipe prayed silently for everything to become pleasant again. Mr. Goff closed his eyes, as though anticipating something heavy. Purbright nodded, gently encouraging the truth to keep speaking. "And did she tell you," he asked, "how she hoped to accomplish that?" Lydia looked at him then, fully, eyes not angry, but suddenly terribly tired. "She planned things," Lydia said. "She planned everything."
Even grief, even her absence.
She believed people do not mourn naturally. They must be directed. Purbright did not move. "She told me," Lydia whispered, "that the worst fate was to be buried and forgotten in the same day." Mrs. Prouse inhaled sharply. Reverend Snipe bowed his head. Mr. Tolliver watched with scientific fascination, as though examining a rare bird that had wandered into town. "And you," Purbright said quietly, "wanted to help her?" It was not accusation. It was kindness made unbearable. Lydia's face did not crumble. She was not the crumbling type. But the stillness in her expression changed.
A held breath released. "I wanted to honor her," she said. "Not save her. Not protect her.
Not hide her. Honor, which meant something, which meant everything. No one else spoke. The tea room around them went on with its quiet clatter of teacups and careful gossip, entirely unaware that something delicate had shifted here, something that would not be reversed. Purbright let the silence settle. He did not press. He did not conclude. He simply offered, "Grief is rarely clean, Miss Rook, and love even less so." Lydia's eyes lowered. Not in shame, in relief. He stood. "Thank you for your time," he said lightly. "This has been very helpful, no?" One quite knew what he meant, which was exactly as he intended. The drawing room of Bletchem & Co. was chosen for the occasion, partly because it was neutral ground and partly because it contained no sentimental associations. It was difficult to sustain drama in a room decorated entirely in beige. The participants sat arranged as though for a modest seminar in polite disappointment. Inspector Purbright, composed, hands folded. Lydia Rook, pale but dignified, spine very straight. Reverend Snipe,
Anxious and fluttering internally. Mr. Goff, arms crossed tightly.
the set of his jaw a form of self-defense. Miss Pell, silent, observant, the single witness who would remember every detail correctly. Constable Malley, trying very hard not to look as though he was expecting a ghost to burst in at any moment, and Mr. Bletchem, who had already decided in advance that no one involved would be satisfied by the outcome. Purbright spoke first, and softly. "There is no need for alarm," he said, "nor shame. What has occurred is deeply human."
And, I believe, rooted in affection rather than harm. Lydia closed her eyes once.
Very briefly, not in dread, but in acceptance. Purbright continued. Mrs. Clementine Rook died peacefully, in her bed 3 nights before the funeral. No violence, no struggle. Her doctor confirms this. She did not fear death itself, only what came after it. Silence held, steady and fragile. Mrs. Rook believed, Purbright went on, that death erases people too quickly. She worried that the town would speak of her for 1 or 2 days, then resume ordinary life and never think of her again. She did not fear death. She feared vanishing. Lydia's hands tightened in her lap. She prepared for her funeral, Purbright said. She selected her coffin, her inscription, and even the small silver bells sewn into the lining, not to be rung, but as a symbol.
A gesture.
She wished her presence to linger. Reverend Snipe nodded weakly. He had suspected as much, but had not understood the shape of the truth. Purbright turned to Lydia, gently. What Mrs. Rook did not prepare for was how the living would feel in her absence. That task fell to her niece. Lydia did not speak. She did not need to. Purbright continued. Miss Rook visited the vestry the night before the funeral. She returned the handbag, a familiar object associated with her aunt's daily presence, and left the note inside, written days earlier.
Not to deceive, not to frighten.
But so the town would remember Mrs. Rook felt present still. Mrs. Prowse might have fainted at this revelation, but Mrs. Prowse was thankfully not present. Purbright's tone remained level, almost tender. Lydia did not impersonate her aunt in the street. The sighting at the post office was imagination, memory mistaken for presence, as happens when someone is newly lost. Miss Pell nodded once. She had seen such things often enough in the library. But the cemetery visit, Purbright said, was real. Mally tensed. The ghost portion of the story had been his private concern. Purbright spoke carefully. On the night Mrs. Cribben saw the figure in black, that was not Mrs. Rook. That was Reverend Snipe. Snipe startled as though struck.
Inspector, I only... Purbright raised a hand. Not to silence, but to steady. You are not at fault.
You were not staging a haunting. You were simply doing what clergy
have done for centuries, tending grief where you...
believed it needed tending. Snipe's shoulders slumped in relief and...
Resignation. I went to place my hand on the...
soil, he admitted. Not to disturb, just to reassure.
I thought it might comfort someone. Perhaps me, perhaps her.
No one laughed. No one mocked him. The room softened. Purbright nodded, and so the grave bore footprints, and the soil appeared smoothed, and Mrs. Cribben, seeing shawl and silhouette, supplied identity from longing rather than fact. Mally exhaled, perhaps for the first time in 2 days. Purbright now turned, gently,
inevitably, to Mr. Goff. And the knocking, Goff straightened defensively. I sealed that coffin properly. I inspected everything. Purbright raised a quieting palm. Yes, he said.
You did. Mrs. Rook's coffin was sealed properly. The knocking was not from inside. Goff inhaled through his nose. Guilt without wrongdoing. Purbright looked down briefly, then up again. The pallbearer at the front, left, shifted his grip. The coffin tilted. The decorative silver bell inside the pillow lining rang against the inner board. It was no more supernatural than the shifting of a teaspoon inside a drawer. The explanation was simple. The effect had been profound. Reverend Snipe let out a long, shuddered breath. The town had been haunted not by death, but sound. Purbright's voice softened now, to the gentlest tone he ever used, and Lydia, in her grief, in her love, and in her fear of letting her aunt pass unnoticed, allowed the town to imagine a little more than was real. Lydia's chin trembled, not weeping, just letting go of something held too long. I didn't mean harm, she whispered. She wanted to be seen. Purbright nodded, and she was, no accusation.
No judgment.
Just the truth, placed like a hand upon a grave, smoothing, not disturbing. Silence settled again. But this silence was peaceful, not fearful. Purbright stood. No charges will be made, he said. No public explanation required. The town will forget the details in 2 weeks and remember only that Mrs. Rook was loved, which is...
I think what she wanted. Lydia closed her eyes. And this time...
The relief did bring a tear. Reverend Snipe murmured a prayer under his breath, one of gratitude rather than grief. Goff nodded. Solemn, professional, unchanged but lighter. Miss Pell folded her hands, quietly satisfied that truth once again
had been tidied. Constable Mally wrote nothing. Wisely, Purbright simply put on his coat. There is a great deal of paperwork to be done, he said gently.
as there always is. And he left the room as he had entered life in Flaxborough, calmly, kindly, without triumph, because the dead had been settled. And now it was the living who could rest. Flaxborough was a place that accommodated change reluctantly, and only after giving the matter due suspicion. Yet, as with all towns, time moved even when no one admitted to noticing. Within a week, the talk of Mrs. Rook's supposed wanderings had softened into something no longer alarming, but comfortably sentimental. The story shifted shape, not a haunting, but a fond recollection, a curiosity, a tale to be told with a smile rather than a shudder. The cemetery no longer drew onlookers at twilight. The grass resumed its quiet occupation of simply being grass. The church vestry door regained its firm latch. The bell in the coffin, so fervently debated in whispers, passed into the gentle obscurity of anecdote. Life, as always, found its level. Lydia Rook reopened the shop in a steady, deliberate way. She did not attempt improvements nor dramatic displays. She simply kept it open, her movements quiet, her posture a little less rigid than before. People entered more often now, some to purchase stationery, others to look at Lydia in that new, softened way one looks at someone who has lived a piece of life one hopes never to experience personally. She was polite. She did not elaborate. She did not conceal. She existed, and that was enough. From time to time, she placed a single flower at her aunt's grave, not to be seen, not to direct mourning, but simply because she wished to. That, in Flaxborough, counted as a spiritual revelation. Reverend Snipe regained his composure by degrees. He began speaking more confidently from the pulpit, though his sermons now contained fewer warnings about sin and more suggestions that kindness was a form of courage. He still checked the vestry latch twice each evening, but now he did so without fear, only habit. And when he saw Lydia in the pews, which he now did sometimes, he smiled, a quiet, unassuming smile, meant only for the human acknowledgement of another's effort to continue. Mr. Goff, at the undertaker's, resumed his work with renewed solemn dignity. He handled coffins as though handling the grammar of endings, precise, careful, never theatrical. Occasionally, he would catch sight of the silver bell inventory page in his ledger. He never removed it. He did not add to it. Its presence reminded him that the living have reasons beyond comprehension, and that his work was not merely to bury, but to recognize. He did not say this aloud. He simply polished wood more thoughtfully. Miss Pell told no one the details of what had been explained in the drawing-room. She did not need to. She knew that stories travel fastest when there are no facts attached to weigh them down. She returned to shelving books, recommending novels to those who did not ask for them, and maintaining, but with quiet satisfaction, the knowledge that truth, properly tended, requires no audience. Mrs. Prowse found her enthusiasm for fainting had waned. The drama had passed, leaving her not disappointed, but oddly content. She now told the tale of the funeral knocking with the air of one describing a curious but harmless event. Of course, she would declare, tapping her teacup for emphasis, it was simply a bell shifting in the coffin. Perfectly ordinary. But my word, it was memorable. Her listeners nodded politely, savouring that Flaxborough had hosted an event of significance without requiring tragedy. She did not mention hiding behind her pantry door. This omission was universally respected. As for Inspector Purbright, he returned, as he always did, to paperwork, not as a retreat, nor as distraction, but because paperwork was where the living and the dead shared equal space. Dates, details, closures, signatures, a record in quiet ink that things had happened and been survived. He sat at his desk one afternoon, The window opened to let in the mild smell of damp stone and distant bread ovens. He wrote his report with care, but without haste. No crime committed.
No suspects sought.
No charges recommended. He paused only once, pen balanced lightly, to consider the proper phrasing for what had transpired. Finally, he wrote, "This was a matter of grief expressed, not malice concealed." He blotted the ink, closed the file, and placed it gently in the cabinet where such truths rested. He stood, looked out toward the churchyard where the trees moved gently in the breeze, and breathed in the unremarkable air of a town that had, once again, avoided the temptation to become larger than life. Then he sat again and continued with the ordinary work of a day in which nothing dramatic was expected. And nothing dramatic occurred, just life, which was enough.